Hi, welcome to week 2 of Radical Behaviorism. This week, we will be talking about the basic assumptions of radical behaviorism. For the purpose of this PIM, the PIM is to orient you to the readings as stated earlier. So it will contain a brief overview of what to expect, um, in terms of the topics and sort of the terminology that we will be using as we go through the readings and discussion of this week. So, as we've talked about ad nauseum last week, radical behaviorism is the underlying philosophy of the science of behavior, which posits that um, behavior is a function of its environment and not as a result of inner causes. When we adopt radical behaviorism as a philosophy or a worldview, it gives us a perspective or a lens by which we can examine any behavior, all behavior within its context in any given moment. Um, so today we will be introducing some new terminology or some familiar, some new. We call this behavioral taxonomy, which is basically the vocabulary in terms of which the various procedures and phenomena of behavior can be organized. So in order for the laws of behaviorism to hold, as well as the as well as implementing or using a lens of radical behaviorism to examine behavior, we then organize how we understand behavior and its relationship to the environment. And that's what behavioral taxonomy is. So the underlying principle of behaviorism is determinism. This is a law of the universe, which states that we assume the universe to be lawful and orderly, which means that events don't occur at random or without cause. Free will as a concept states that choice is not determined by environmental variables. So as we can see, upholding the law of determinism conflicts or contradicts our an understanding of free will. So if we assume determinism to be true and therefore radical behaviorism to be true, then we have to understand that, or we have to arrive at the conclusion that free will is not really a thing, or free will is not a reality, because in our universe or in our perspective, choice is always governed by a plethora of variables that can be determined, or even if you don't know what environmental variables are evoking or eliciting a specific behavior, you still know that that is likely why a behavior occurs. So what does this mean for freedom then, right? So even if we're saying that free will is not a thing, does this mean that man is controlled or man does not have freedom? I say man, but humans, do we not have freedom? What is the distinction between free will and feeling free? There's a misunderstanding or a misconception that because behaviorism follows determinism, that we are saying that humans don't act freely. And that's not necessarily true, right? Based on what we talked about last week, we are simply stating that behaviors are emitted dependent or in relation to their environment. And therefore, a science of behavior simply allows us to potentially understand or analyze the contingencies that are in place that would evoke a certain behavior or would result in a behavior being emitted by an organism. All this also means that we are, to a certain degree, able to predict and control behavior because we are able to manipulate or select or arrange contingencies of the environment in order for behaviors to be evoked. So this doesn't necessarily mean that organisms cannot experience freedom. We simply redefine what freedom means, and we say that freedom is simply the existence of a broad repertoire of multiple choices that are largely governed by reinforcing contingencies. So choice in the same way is a response allocation, right? Choices are made because organisms tend to allocate responding in a specific way depending on the contingencies of reinforcement that are available in a context. What is the advantage of perceiving behavior this way? Perceiving behavior this way allows us to take away any moral judgments of behavior, and we don't put the onus of the behavior of organisms on the behavior, on the organism itself, because we don't say that a person did something because they're a bad person, or that they're a bad person because they did something. We examine sort of the contingencies that are in place that result or that evoke a specific behavior that may lead to some harmful consequences, either for the organism itself or towards other organisms. So this kind of like morality or judgment of behavior as like good, bad, high, low, desired, undesired, all of those things can be sort of negated. We can still work towards shaping or building repertoires with behaviors that promote values consistency, or that promote desired sort of consequences in terms of like productivity, or like choices you make about choices made in certain contexts. But we don't then place value or place judgment on the behaving organism itself for engaging in a behavior. And we don't sort of place the blame on an organism for engaging in a specific behavior, because that behavior is simply a result of its context.
Can pigeons read? This one gives every indication, because he's been taught to distinguish between two words and to behave appropriately. He's learned his different response to each sign by being rewarded with food. So the bird isn't acting independently. Its behavior is shaped by controlling its environment. The first task was to isolate an individual piece of behavior and see how that could be changed. Skinner did this by keeping individual pigeons at about 3/4 of their normal weight, so that the birds were always hungry, and food could be used as an automatic reward. The pigeon was studied in a uniform box, one it quickly grew used to. One piece of behavior, pecking a colored disc, was measured on a graph. The pigeon learned that pecking the disc produced a reward. Then the behavior of pecking could be studied in relation to how often that reward was offered, or in Skinner's terms, what was the schedule of reinforcement.
The main thing is what we call schedules of reinforcement. Reinforcement is what the layman calls reward, and you can schedule it so that a reward occurs every now and then when a pigeon does something. We usually use a response with pigeon pecking a little disc, a little spot on the wall, and you can reinforce with food. But you don't reinforce every time. You're perhaps every 10th time, or perhaps only once every minute or something like that. There are a very large number of schedules. and they have their special effects. And there is a good example of how you can move from the pigeon to the human case, because one of the schedules which is very effective with rats or pigeons is what we call the variable ratio schedule, and that is at the heart of all gambling devices and has the same effect. The pigeon can become a pathological gambler just as a person can. Now, the fact that we found that out with pigeons and could prove it by removing and changing the schedule makes it easy for us to interpret the case with the human subject. We don't say that the human subject gambles to punish himself, as the Freudians might say, or gambles because he feels excited when he does so. Nothing of the sort. People gamble because of the schedule of the reinforcement that follows. And this is true of all gambling systems. They all have variable ratios built into them. So what we've learned from the pigeon, it made it possible to interpret this vast field very effectively.
Where does that leave free will? Because we all think we have a choice whether to do things or not to do things.
Yes, well, you see, it leaves it in the position of a fiction. We have assumed somehow or other that these internal states, feelings, and so on have initiated something. They have started something. They have created. We have done something in a voluntary way. We have willed to act. If you now look at the actual history, we find that there are external reasons why this has happened. In other words, by discovering the causes of behavior, we can dispose of the imagined internal cause. We dispose of free will as an American divine of the 18th century, Jonathan Edwards, did. He said, we believe in free will because we know about our behavior, but not about its causes. And of course, it's the object of a science of behavior to discover causes. And once you have found those causes, there is less you need to attribute to an internal act of will, and eventually, I think you need to attribute nothing to it.
So, as Skinner was talking about, psychology typically allocates causes or the reasons why people behave that in a specific way to some sort of inner state or internal state, right? This is what we behavior analysts call mentalism, or a mentalistic perspective, because that perspective places the cause of behavior inside the organism. So it posits that there's an inner state that causes external behavior. We either say that this is happening, well, we don't as behavior analysts, but people that follow mentalism or mentalists place this cause at a neural level or a psychic level or a conceptual level. So like creating constructs and things like that as the reason why behavior occurs. Whereas behavior analysts, we talk in terms of correlation and causation, right? So we distinguish between correlation and causation in order for us to determine what particular events that are occurring that evoke, what particular events in the environment or what environmental variables are responsible or correspond to the emergence of certain behaviors. So correlation is the is when we observe covariant occurrence of events. So the probability of an event is determined by the probability of some other event that we determine is corresponding because of the way that they co-occur. This is usually how statistical analyses are done. So think about correlational examples are something they can seem quite bizarre, but that doesn't mean that they don't necessarily have value. It's just not quite as precise in terms of divining the cause of behavior. So the correlation between the number of people that eat ice cream in Michigan and the correlation with the amount of produce sold in the grocery stores, we could say that if we notice sort of high high occurrence of both of those things, statistically, we could say that they have some correlation, right? But do they necessarily cause one another simply because they co-vary in specific ways? Correlation does not give us that answer. Causation, however, states that change in one event results in a corresponding change in another event. So by systematically manipulating environmental variables, we are able to determine to a certain degree that a certain behavior may be emitted when this permutation combination of environmental variables and contingencies of reinforcement and schedules of reinforcement come together, and are able to reasonably predict and thus control behavior. Some of the other terms that you'll notice that show up when in the discussion of mentalism, correlation, and causation are, one, explanatory fiction. So that's kind of what Skinner was referencing when he was describing free will in that video. Explanatory fiction is the same set of facts being described by both the behavior that is supposedly being explained and by the explanation itself. So an example of this could be someone saying that their child is acting out only because they have ADHD. Now, from a behaviorist perspective, the brain of a person with ADHD, which may or may not vary in comparison to a neuroconformative brain or a neurotypical brain, may impact the behaviors that are being shaped by the environment of that person. So it's not that we're saying that ADHD or any other kind of neurodivergence doesn't have an impact on behavior, but we're saying that they're not causal in an inner-outer way. In the same way, hypothetical constructs are non-observable postulated events that are set to explain behavior. So if you've read Freudian theory before, Freud came up with a device or a construct called ego in the id, ego, superego paradigm. And this basically, it's a construct that's not physical. It doesn't exist in a way, or doesn't exist in a deterministic way, or doesn't exist in a, well, I suppose it exists in a deterministic way simply because it cause is attributed to it. But hypothetical constructs are not a satisfactory explanation for why a behavior is caused, because again, it sort of relies on constructs that can't be observed because they're not physical in the sense of events that can be observed. In the same way, teleology is a philosophy that comes from Greek word telos, meaning end, and logos, meaning reason, which is the explanation of phenomena in terms of the purpose they serve rather than the cause by which they arise. So when we talk about teleology, mentalism is a good example of a teleological construct or a teleological philosophy, because we are stating that that behaviors occur to serve a specific function, as opposed to not to serve a specific function in the way that we talk about function as behavior analysts, but that behaviors fulfill certain purpose. So the purpose of free will, for example, then by sort of the contingencies in place that would enable, evoke, or emit behaviors of feeling free. So again, Skinner talked about within radical behaviorism how stimulus-response relations determine behavior change. So with Pavlov, we saw reflex behaviors being explained this way. And of course, in operant conditioning, we have selection by consequences. The big ones are, of course, thoughts and feelings. So radical behaviorism, as you know, accounts for thoughts and feelings as behavior, and thus posits that because thoughts and feelings are behavior, they are also manipulable as based on the arrangement of contingencies or selection of contingencies in the same way as overt behavior. This is based on the philosophy of monism, which rejects any splitting of man into parts and views him as a unified organism of great complexity and varied functioning. So we don't divide the behavior of the organism as inner or outer, or by saying that thoughts and feelings occur on a different dimension than overt behavior, right? All behavior is behavior. Specifically, we prescribe to physical monism. Dualism, which is the conflicting theory, considers reality to consist of two irreducible elements or modes. So typically in psychology, that prescribes to sort of this mentalistic view, you will come across something called the mind-body problem, which is basically, is the mind part of the body or body part of the mind? If they are distinct, then how do they interact? And which of the two is in charge? These are kind of the questions that show up for dualistic theories, because they consider them to be two different things or distinct things. Similarly, within behavior analysis, we also have some other shifting paradigms, right? So from Skinnerian behaviorism, we have a molecular analysis of behavior, which is based on temporal. Both molecular and molar are based on temporal contiguity. Temporal contiguity is the result of, or the association that's formed between two stimuli that are experienced close together in time. So a molecular analysis focuses on momentary contingencies in explaining responding. So behavior is explained simply by the contingencies that are immediately observable in an environment, which is where Skinner started. There has been a paradigm shift in behavior analysis where we take a more, we take a broader sort of bird's eye view while still holding on to our basic principles. This is called a molar analysis of behavior. So behavior can be understood best in the context of an organism's learning history. So not only is it sufficient that we observe or make relations between the ABCs in the present moment, but we also examine how an organism's learning history shows up in the present context to influence behavior change.